Welcome back, everyone. I'm Ryan Lamas,
And I'm Rana Scleto.
and we're ready for another deep dive. You know the drill. You give us the sources.
We extract the gold.
That's right, the good stuff. Today, we're tackling a huge topic. Cancer.
From a whole new perspective.
That's right. We're going to be looking at it a little differently this time. We're diving into this interview from Thinkiverse podcast.
Their tagline is, unlocking knowledge across the spectrum every day.
They're talking to Dr. Thomas Seyfried. He's a biology professor who's been researching cancer for, forever.
Decades.
And he's got this really bold claim.
Which is?
He says cancer is mainly a metabolic disorder. Not just a genetic one, but metabolic scope.
That's really interesting because it has a lot of implications for how we could prevent it, treat it.
Potentially make it a lot less scary.
Definitely.
But let's just break it down, okay? Starting with the basics. What does he even mean by metabolic?
You know how our bodies need energy to function, do things, move around? That energy comes from the food we eat, right? So metabolism is just that whole process of our bodies breaking down the food, getting the energy out of it, and then using that energy to power, everything we do.
It's like our body's engine.
Exactly. And Dr. Seyfried says that when this engine isn't working right, it can lead to cancer.
Now, hold on, because I always hear cancer comes from, genetic mutations, right? Damaged DNA. How does that fit in?
Well, that's where things get super interesting. Because Dr. Seyfried believes that those genetic mutations, they're a symptom.
They're not the cause.
Not the root cause. He gives this example. Imagine a car. If the engine's busted, the car is not going to run right, even if every single part looks fine from the outside.
Right.
So basically, the damaged DNA...
That's like the sputtering engine.
Yeah, but something else is causing that damage in the first place.
Okay, I'm with you. So what is that something else then?
Dr. Seyfried says it's this tiny part of our cells called the mitochondria.
Mitochondria. I kind of remember those from middle school science class.
You know, the powerhouse of the cell.
Yeah. They make energy, right?
Exactly. Now imagine those little powerhouses, they're damaged.
Ooh, that's not good.
Or malfunctioning. He calls this mitochondrial dysfunction.
Okay.
And he thinks it's like the key.
The key to cancer.
Yeah. So picture this. If the mitochondria are messed up,
right,
cells can't get the energy they need the right way.
I see where this is going. So they have to get energy some other way.
That's where it gets kind of technical.
Lay it on me.
Healthy cells, they get energy through respiration.
Respiration, like breathing.
Kinda. It's very efficient.
So I'm guessing cancer cells don't do that.
Nope. When the mitochondria are messed up, they switch to this less efficient process called fermentation.
Fermentation, like what makes bread rise?
Yeah, same basic idea. But here, it means the cells are like burning fuel.
In a bad way.
The less efficient way.
And that leads to problems.
All sorts of them, including cancer.
So cancer cells are kind of like cars sputtering along.
Yeah, running on fumes. They're surviving.
Barely.
But they're not thriving.
Right.
And while they're doing that, they're messing things up around them, damaging other cells and tissues. It's not good.
I'm already fascinated. And hey, if you love learning about this kind of stuff, you got to check out Thinkiverse podcast.
Their YouTube channel.
Yeah, seriously. They have so many cool videos that break down complex topics.
Yeah, definitely hit that subscribe button.
Back to the science. Dr. Seyfried says this whole idea isn't even new.
Really?
He points to Otto Warburg.
Who's that?
He was this scientist back in the 1920s.
Wow, way back.
He even won a Nobel Prize.
Impressive.
And get this, he was already talking about how cancer cells rely on fermentation.
But nobody listened to him.
Well, his work kind of got ignored by the mainstream science at the time.
Wow. So Dr. Seyfried is building on that older research.
Exactly. He's taking that, plus all we know now about mitochondrial dysfunction.
And putting it all together.
He's like, hey, we've been focused on the wrong thing. We've been looking at the smoke.
The mutations.
But ignoring the fire.
The damaged mitochondria.
So, okay, let's say this is all true. What's causing all this damage to the mitochondria in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question.
It is, right.
And Dr. Seyfried has some ideas about that. He says there are some lifestyle factors that can really mess with your mitochondria.
Like what?
Lack of exercise is a big one.
Okay, I'm guilty of that.
Then there's diet, specifically eating too many processed foods and too much sugar.
Oh no, my favorite things.
Chronic stress is another culprit.
I'm stressed just thinking about all this.
And even lack of sleep.
It's rough.
It all adds up. We usually hear about those things in connection with heart disease or diabetes.
Yeah, all right.
But Dr. Seyfried argues that they're all damaging our mitochondria.
Which then leads to a whole cascade of problems.
Including cancer.
So it's all connected. This is starting to make a lot of sense. But how do we know if our mitochondria are healthy or not? Can we, test for that?
There is a way. Dr. Seyfried talks about something called the glucose ketone index, or GKI.
GKI.
Yeah.
Break it down.
Okay, ketones. Remind me what those are again.
Think of them like a backup fuel source.
Yeah.
Your body can use them when it's not getting enough glucose.
Glucose is sugar, right?
Yep, the kind that comes from carbs.
Got it. So this GKI, it measures the ratio of glucose to ketones in your blood.
Exactly. And that ratio can tell you a lot about how healthy your metabolism is.
Okay, so how does this GKI thing work? What's a good score?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than just good or bad. It really depends on what your goals are and your overall health.
I figured it couldn't be that simple.
But in general, a lower GKI means your body is burning more ketones
Okay.
and less glucose.
No, why is that a good thing?
Remember how we said cancer cells love glucose?
Yeah, they use it for fuel, right? Like those
Yeah.
sputtering cars. Exactly. So if you lower your GKI, you're basically taking away their favorite food.
Starve them out.
Yeah.
So if we can keep our GKI in a good range,
you might be able to stop cancer from developing in the first place.
that's amazing. So this isn't just about treating cancer that's already there.
It's about prevention, too.
I love that. This is all so fascinating.
Isn't it?
But what about people who already have cancer? Can this metabolic approach help them too?
That's what we're going to talk about next. Dr. Seyfried has developed something called metabolic therapy.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. This is different from chemo and radiation, right?
Oh, yeah. Completely different approach. Remember, the main goal here is to starve those cancer cells.
Deprive them of glucose.
Yes. While at the same time giving healthy cells the fuel they need to thrive.
Which is ketones.
Bingo. So metabolic therapy is all about getting your body to burn ketones instead of sugar.
Makes sense. And how do you do that?
It's mostly about diet.
Okay, what kind of diet are we talking about here?
He recommends something called a ketogenic diet. Keto, isn't that like Atkins?
It's similar, yeah. Very low carbs, high healthy fats.
Yeah, like avocados?
Yep. Nuts, olive oil, all that good stuff.
And lots of veggies?
Non-starchy ones.
So you're basically cutting out sugar.
Pretty much processed foods.
And grains.
Most of them.
Sounds pretty strict.
It's definitely an adjustment. But this isn't just about losing weight.
Right.
This is a way to treat cancer.
Seriously reduce that glucose.
So those cancer cells can't get to it.
Okay, I get it. So this keto diet, that's the main part of metabolic therapy.
This is a big piece, yeah. But Dr. Seyfried also talks about targeting another thing cancer cells love.
What's that?
Glutamine.
Glutamine.
It's an amino acid.
Yeah.
One of the building blocks of protein.
Okay.
And it turns out cancer cells use glutamine to grow.
And multiply.
Right. So
Oh.
we need to cut that off too.
Like cutting off their fertilizer.
Exactly. There are a few ways to do that. Medication is one option.
There are drugs that specifically target glutamine.
Yep. So it's a combo.
Diet and medication. Working together.
That makes sense. But what about side effects? I mean, chemo and radiation can be really rough.
Right.
Is metabolic therapy any better?
That's one of the coolest things about it. Because it's working with your body's natural systems, the side effects are usually way less intense.
That's huge.
You might feel a little tired at first.
Or get some flu-like symptoms while your body adjusts.
Yeah, but it's nothing compared to chemo.
No hair loss?
No constant nausea.
I am on board with that.
Yeah.
So where do I sign up?
Well, it's not quite that easy. It's not a magic bullet.
I figure.
Everyone responds differently,
Right.
and it might not work for everyone.
That's true of any treatment, really.
But Dr. Seyfried has some really interesting evidence.
Tell me, you mentioned some case studies earlier.
Yeah. He talks about this guy, Pablo Kelly, from England.
Yeah.
He was diagnosed with glioblastoma.
Oh, wow. That's a really aggressive brain cancer, right?
Yeah, very aggressive. Most people with glioblastoma,
They don't live very long?
sadly, no, usually only a couple of years.
Oh, wow.
But Pablo, he said no to chemo
And radiation.
and went with metabolic therapy instead.
That's a big decision. What happened?
He lived for 10 years after his diagnosis.
No way. That's so much longer than expected.
It really is. And he did it without the harsh side effects.
You just focus on diet and lifestyle changes?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Amazing, right?
That gives me so much hope. Are there other stories like that?
There are. Dr. Seyfried also mentions a guy named glutamine.
Okay.
He had advanced prostate cancer.
Oh, wow.
Plus, he had hypertension, diabetes, and he was obese.
That's a lot to deal with.
It is. But Gu decided to try metabolic therapy.
Good for him.
And he even incorporated some extended water fasts.
Water fasts, like no food at all.
Yep. For days at a time. It sounds crazy.
It does.
But it can really jumpstart your body into burning ketones.
And how did Gu do?
It's pretty incredible. His diabetes completely gone.
Where?
His hypertension vanished.
Wow.
He lost a ton of weight.
And the cancer?
Undetectable.
Okay, hold the phone. That's incredible.
It really highlights how powerful this approach can be. It's not just about cancer.
It's about overall health.
It's like hitting the reset button on your whole body.
This is all so inspiring, but I have to admit it's also a little overwhelming. It's a lot to process. Like if someone's listening to this thinking, okay, I want to try this, where do they even begin?
I get it. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
It's so different from how we usually think about cancer. Dr. Seyfried knows there's going to be resistance.
From doctors.
Yeah, the medical establishment.
But why? If this has so much potential, why wouldn't doctors be on board?
Well, for one, it's still a pretty new area of research.
So a lot of doctors haven't been trained in it.
Exactly. They might be hesitant to recommend something they're not familiar with.
Right, that makes sense. But it's still frustrating for patients who want to explore this option.
I agree. It is frustrating. The good news is that more and more doctors are learning about metabolic therapy.
That's good.
They're starting to embrace it.
So if someone wants to find one of these doctors, how do they do that?
That's a great question. It might take some searching online.
Like where?
You could start by looking for metabolic therapy doctors
Okay.
or ketogenic oncology in your area.
Those are good keywords.
And don't be afraid to be your own advocate.
Ask your doctor questions.
And don't be afraid to explore your options.
It's your health. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I have one more question, though. Dr. Seyfried mentions this evolutionary aspect to all of this. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So he basically argues that for almost all of human history, our ancestors were in ketosis.
Like their bodies were naturally burning ketones.
Exactly, because they weren't eating all the refined sugars and processed foods that we do.
Right.
Their bodies evolved to run on ketones.
So we've messed up our metabolisms by eating a modern diet.
That's what he's saying, and there's a lot of evidence to back that up. He thinks by going back to a way of eating that's more like what our ancestors ate.
We could prevent cancer.
And treat it.
And just be healthier overall.
Exactly. It's like we're rediscovering ancient wisdom through science.
And it gives us more control over our health.
Absolutely.
I love that. This whole conversation has been such a breath of fresh air.
I agree. It's really empowering.
It is. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
I
want to remind everyone about Thinkiverse podcast.
Over on YouTube.
They're the ones who brought us this amazing interview with Dr. Seyfried.
And their channel is full of fascinating deep dives.
Definitely hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out.
You won't regret it.
Okay, let's move on to the last part of our exploration and see where Dr. Seyfried's research leaves us with some final thoughts.
So we've talked about how Dr. Seyfried sees cancer, right? It's all about metabolism, the mitochondria.
Yeah, that whole engine analogy.
Exactly. Now, let's get into what he thinks we should do about it. He calls it metabolic therapy.
Yeah, that's what I'm really curious about. Is this like chemo, radiation?
No, totally different approach. Remember, we're trying to starve those cancer cells?
Cut off their fuel supply?
Yeah. Glucose. That's what they love.
And give healthy cells what they need.
Which is?
Ketones.
Yeah.
We talked about that.
You got it. So metabolic therapy, it's all about making that switch.
From burning sugar
to burning ketones.
Okay, how do we make that happen?
Diet plays a huge role.
What kind of diet are we talking about?
Dr. Seyfried recommends a ketogenic diet.
Keto? Yeah, I've heard of that.
Super low in carbs, high in healthy fats.
Lots of avocados, nuts, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Non-starchy veggies, too.
So no sugar, no processed junk.
Pretty much. And most grains are out, too.
That sounds tough.
It's an adjustment, for sure. But remember, this isn't just a diet.
Right, this is therapy.
We're trying to seriously reduce the glucose.
So those cancer cells can't get to it.
Exactly.
Starve them out. So the keto diet, that's the main part of metabolic therapy.
It's a big part, yeah. But there's something else Dr. Seyfried talks about, another fuel source that cancer cells love.
What is it?
Glutamine.
Glutamine. Never heard of it.
It's an amino acid, one of the building blocks of protein.
Okay.
And cancer cells gobble it up.
They use it to grow.
Yeah, to grow and multiply.
So we got to cut off that supply, too.
Right. It's like their fertilizer.
How do we do that?
Well, there are medications that target glutamine metabolism.
Really? Drugs that specifically do that?
Yep. So it's like a two-pronged attack.
Diet and medication.
Working together.
That makes sense. Okay. I have to ask, what about side effects? Chemo and radiation, they can be brutal.
Right.
Is metabolic therapy any easier on the body?
That's one of the things that makes it so appealing. because you're working with the body's natural processes.
Okay.
The side effects tend to be much milder.
That's great.
You might experience some fatigue at the beginning.
I'm just feeling tired.
Yeah, or maybe some flu-like symptoms while your body adjusts to burning ketones instead of sugar.
Makes sense.
But it's nothing like the debilitating side effects of chemo.
That's a huge plus. So, no more hair loss, nausea, all that.
Well, hold on. It's not a magic cure. Everyone responds differently.
Of course.
There's no guarantee it'll work for everyone.
That's true for any treatment.
But Dr. Seyfried does have some really compelling evidence.
Like what? You mentioned case studies earlier.
Yeah. He talks about this guy, Pablo Kelly from England.
Okay.
He was diagnosed with glioblastoma.
That's a type of brain cancer, right?
Yeah, really aggressive.
I know, it doesn't have a good prognosis.
Most people with glioblastoma, they don't live longer than a couple of years.
That's terrible.
But Pablo, he refused chemo and radiation.
Wow.
He decided to go with metabolic therapy.
That's a brave choice. How did he do?
He lived for 10 years after his diagnosis.
Are you serious?
It's way beyond what anyone expected.
And he did it without all those horrible side effects.
Yep. Just diet and lifestyle changes.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is. It's so inspiring. And there are other stories, too.
Really? Tell me.
Dr. Seyfried also talks about this guy named glutamine.
Okay.
He had advanced prostate cancer,
Oh, wow.
plus hypertension, diabetes, and he was obese.
That's a lot on his plate.
It is. But he decided to try metabolic therapy.
Good for him.
And he even did some extended water fasts.
Water fast, so like no food at all.
Yep, for days at a time. It sounds extreme, but it can really kick your body into burning ketones.
And how did that work out for Go?
Hold on to your hat. His diabetes, gone.
Gone. Like cured.
Yeah. Hypertension, gone. He lost a ton of weight.
And the cancer.
Undetectable.
No way.
It's incredible, right?
It's like a whole body transformation.
Exactly. It shows you how powerful this approach can be.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. But I gotta be honest, it's also a little overwhelming. Like if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I want to try this, where do they even start?
I hear you. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
It's such a different way of thinking about cancer, and Dr. Seyfried knows there's going to be resistance.
Resistance from who?
From doctors, from the medical establishment.
But why? If this is so promising, why wouldn't they be all over it?
Well, it's still a pretty new area of research.
So not a lot of doctors have experience with it.
Exactly, and a lot of them might be hesitant to recommend something they haven't been trained in.
Right. That makes sense, but it's still frustrating for patients.
It is. It is frustrating. But there is some good news.
What's that?
More and more doctors are becoming aware of metabolic therapy.
Oh, that's good.
They're starting to see the potential and embrace it.
So if you're interested in this, how do you find one of these doctors? Where do you even start?
It's going to take some research. Start by searching online.
For what?
You could try metabolic therapy doctors
Okay.
or ketogenic oncology in your area.
Good keywords.
And the biggest thing, be your own advocate.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Explore all your options.
It's your health. Okay, I have one more question. Dr. Seyfried talks about this evolutionary aspect to all of this. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Basically, he says that for most of human history,
Okay.
our ancestors lived in a state of ketosis.
Their bodies were naturally burning ketones.
Exactly. Because they weren't eating all the refined sugar and processed foods that we eat today.
Right.
Their bodies were adapted to running on ketones.
So you're saying we've kind of messed ourselves up with the modern diet.
That's the argument. And there's a lot of evidence to support it. He thinks that by going back to a way of eating that's more like what our ancestors ate,
We can prevent cancer.
treat it and just be healthier overall.
Wow, it's like rediscovering this ancient wisdom through science.
I know. It's pretty amazing.
It makes you feel like you have more control over your health.
Absolutely.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Right.
let's remind everyone about Thinkiverse podcast.
Their YouTube channel.
They're the ones who brought us this incredible interview with Dr. Seyfried,
Be sure to like and subscribe.
so you don't miss out on any of their amazing content.
They're always putting out new stuff.
Okay, now let's move on to the last part of our exploration. We'll see where Dr. Seyfried's research leads us with some final thoughts. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Dr. Seyfried believes cancer is a metabolic disease, mitochondrial dysfunction,
Right. Those little powerhouses in our cells.
and we've learned about metabolic therapy. But where does he see all this going in the future?
He's actually pretty optimistic.
Oh, it's good to hear.
He thinks that as more and more research comes out, the medical community is going to start coming around.
To his point of view.
Yeah, to this metabolic approach.
That would be huge, like a total shift in how we think about and treat cancer.
It would be. And Dr. Seyfried, he really envisions a future where metabolic health is like the #1 priority.
For preventing cancer.
Exactly.
So instead of waiting for a cancer to develop and then fighting it, we focus on keeping our mitochondria healthy.
And preventing it from happening in the first place.
I love that. Think about it. We wouldn't be constantly bombarded with all these scary messages about cancer. We'd be empowered with knowledge about how to support our bodies.
It would be a completely different world.
It would. So what can our listeners do right now? Like, what are some takeaways they can apply to their own lives?
Well, the first step is awareness. Just knowing that there's a different way of thinking about cancer.
That it's not just a genetic disease.
Right. That there are things you can do to prevent it.
Knowledge is power.
It really is. And then you can start making little changes to support your metabolic health.
Yeah, like what?
Eating more whole, unprocessed foods, cutting back on sugar.
Yeah, those are always good ideas.
Getting regular exercise, managing stress.
And getting enough sleep.
All those things, they make a difference.
They really do. And if you're interested in diving deeper into metabolic therapy,
there are tons of resources online.
You can also talk to your doctor about it.
Definitely be your own advocate.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
And remember, even if you don't have cancer,
taking care of your metabolic health is just good for you.
Exactly. It's one of the best things you can do for your overall well-being.
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. Dr. Seyfried's work is really groundbreaking.
It is. And I can't wait to see where it all goes from here.
Me neither. Okay, before we go, let's give another shout out to Thinkiverse Podcast.
On YouTube. They're the ones who brought us this incredible interview with Dr. Seyfried.
Be sure to like and subscribe to their channel for more awesome content.
And leave them a comment letting them know what you thought of this deep dive.
We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Until next time, keep diving deep into knowledge and take good care of yourselves.